Hello and welcome back to At the Symposium. We're back today and we're going to be reviewing Professing Feminism by Professor Daphne Patai. Now, if you saw my last video, maybe you missed it, this video is a continuation of a book review essentially about Daphne Patai, who was a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a professor in Portuguese and Spanish, but is actually maybe more well noted for her work that she did in describing some of her experiences and the experiences of others in the academy while the feminist curriculums were starting to propagate in different areas in the academy. So this is what this book is about. It's called Professing Feminism and Heterophobia. This is more about sexual harassment allegations and stuff of that nature. They kind of go hand in hand, but I thought it important kind of to review this for a couple reasons. One is because obviously feminism is the big deal today. I used to come back home when I was in college and tell people about all this feminism and racism kind of talk, and people didn't understand what I was talking about. Now everybody, of course, very well understands because it's so pervasive. But Daphne Patai, she goes in all the way back to, the 1990s here is what she's talking about here. And this is part and parcel of why I want to talk about this, because it kind of shows and highlights how far a lot of these ideas go back, and a lot of the experiences that she talks about in here, or others that she interviews talks about in here, they kind of harken back to a lot of things that I think we're feeling now today in the cultural climate, and also maybe notions that you might hear about in the academy if you're kind of abreast to some of the conversations that are happening there, and kind of just the overall sense of what's happening in institutions, and kind of the decay of quality that we're finding in institutions, and the decay in quality of the experience that people are describing in institutions. Whether you're a faculty member or you're a patron or you're a worker or you're a customer or whatever the situation is, on both sides of the equation, we're seeing a lot of decay in a lot of our institutions. And what this highlights is it's showing us that, again, this is not a new thing. It's going back decades and decades. And there's very relatable information in here. So today I want to go and talk about one of the stories in the very beginning, because even its title, I think, really kind of points to and illustrates what's going on in our times, politically and culturally. The subtitle for this chapter is called "Who Owns Women's Studies?" I think this is kind of a question that we're always asking. It's kind of ironic, though, however, that most of the kind of questions that relate to that question, who owns this and who owns that, is usually framed in some kind of way of, who owns the capitalist society, or it's usually something that has to do with the structure or substructure of a capitalist patriarchy or whatnot. It's more described on the kind of liberal side of the spectrum, about who owns society and who owns culture and all this kind of thing. But she asks, who owns women's studies, right? And this is kind of what we're kind of getting at here, is to say, it's kind of questioning the people that are questioning. Okay, we have questioners, and questioning is a good thing, but now we're kind of questioning the people that are questioning, who owns women's studies? Okay, women's studies is supposed to be about a certain thing. Is it really about that? Who owns it? Who's operating it? What does that look like? How comfortable are people in it? How comfortable are they in it? Do they feel like they're being limited? Do they feel like there's something awkward going on here? Do they feel like they're doing something other than academic work? We're going to address those questions as we read through a little bit of a testimony that Daphne has here of a certain individual that was in the academy. Now, she's not really using their real names here, but they're basically just entries and people describing their experience. So we'll start off here with a lady here we're going to call Margaret. Okay, she speaks in particular of the non-academic goals that many programs adopt, their reliance on professional staff who lack academic credentials, and the feminist apathy of traditional governance procedures. So here we go. She's going to reflect on those ideas now, this lady of which we're calling Margaret. I think that the program was always confused about the identity and its purpose institutionally. Now I'm gonna skip some parts. I'm just going through parts that I'm highlighting here. So I remember even resentment on the part of some of the staff of the Women's Center that we were getting a little too academic. So there's some resentment about being a little too academic in the women's studies. You know, and she's kind of quoting here the notions of others, you know, isn't women's studies really the women's movement? Well, not exactly. And that was the origins of the program. This confusion about academic versus activist goals. Again, something that kind of harkens back to what we've kind of experienced today. Some people question that. What are we really doing in the academy? What are students really doing in culture? Young college students, are they being perpetuated more as academics, or are they being perpetuated as or are groomed maybe, or as activists? Okay. We were supposed to be the public institution where we could be down and dirty, so to speak, and real politicos, real hardline politicos, and not afraid of the struggle and stormy barricades and demonstrations. As a director, I felt a very strong sense of mission, that it was my job to help all women on campus who wanted and needed support. This was the rhetoric of the program, but I always felt that you couldn't do everything and do it with a high quality. I thought I was being hired to be an academic, but I saw, of course, that it was a very complicated organization. There were seats on the program's executive board of staff for the Women's Studies Center, for the community, for this and for that. And during the first years of the program, not too many people were involved who were really academics. That's where I think some of the conflict arose about who were the faculty and who was the program. I did not understand how much self-promotion was involved, how strategies and courses and structures and ideas were being rationalized to serve a particular agenda that was at once personal aggrandizement or security, job security, as well as a particular ideological agenda. Some of the staff didn't think the women's studies ought to be academic at all, but they either couldn't make it themselves in a regular academic context, or they so despised it and were envious of it at the same time, while wanting all the perks. They really wanted to have it both ways. I think they wanted it to be pretty much what it ended up being, a program that had people working for it who were legitimate enough in the eyes of the rest of the university to get the resources and the institutionalization that it needed, and then a privileged existence in a separate realm that was unassailable, so that they would have the same status as the Afro-American, where people would say, you can't touch them. A lot there, very important paragraph there. We'll go back to that. People were threatened by the accomplished women on the faculty, those who had achieved what seemed unattainable to others. I think any woman who was really accomplished in a scholarly way was suspect to some. But I don't think there was a genuine respect for scholarship. She herself says, I had to hide my own ideas and abilities to some extent because of this notion of leveling, that we were all the same. Okay, so there's a lot there. And I'm going to stop there and we're going to kind of retrack our steps here and really talk about the crux of what's going on here. So one thing is a self-aggrandizement. I think I've talked about this before. Sometimes you have in the academy maybe some people that want to teach and other people that want to be liked or be almost performative and get students on their side for particular reasons. And sometimes those reasons can also be political. What she says here at the bottom of the paragraph, we're on page 34, if you have this book or if you're curious, so this is page 34. What she says here about obtaining this unassailable status, and she likens this to Afro-American, which is kind of, I think, a daring thing to say, but I think kind of a poignant point in the sense of kind of exclusivity, right? This is kind of something that kind of goes along very much of what I think there could be considered as a ploy in a lot of political movements where the people that might articulate themselves as the other or the marginalized will start to create an essence around themselves of being untouchable. And when we say untouchable, meaning that you can't really talk about them or scrutinize them in a certain way. We've seen this very much happen with feminist politics with women, and we've also seen this happen with the LGBTQ. It's not so much now today, maybe, especially in the LGBTQ. I think there's more people speaking out about, usually more about how certain policies are being enacted or certain schools or certain governments are allowing certain things to be taught and whatnot. So there's some backlash there. It's more having to do with influence rather than the scrutinization of anyone's personal habits or personal lifestyles. Well, we've also seen this in the terms of in terms of women as well. And this is partially why I wanted to bring this up, because I kind of wanted to give you a more well thought out, kind of more well studied and thought out and kind of firsthand experience from women in the academy who disavow a lot of what's happened here with certain aspects of the feminist movement and how it's infiltrated the academy. Because one of the reasons why is because there's this whole thing now on the manosphere, right, online, that's gained a lot of traction. Someone at the top of that chart, I would say, is someone like Andrew Tate, who has been all over the internet, right? Anybody who's kind of become the symbol of not only of masculinity, but also someone who is disavowing a lot of feminist rhetoric, let's say. My point here is not really to come up with a critique or opinion of Andrew Tate. My point here is to share something that's just, again, a little more eloquent, a little more academic, a little bit more well thought out, a little bit less polemic in a sense, right? And a little bit less sensationalized, and show you that there's stuff out there. There are people that make the same kind of arguments, but in a more eloquent way, that have firsthand experience, that talk about these things. that aren't talking about fighting people in Bugattis and whatnot, or how the other things that others might have to do to gain attention and traction online. Um, Again, not an opinion about them. A YouTuber is different from an academic. A YouTuber is different from, I know some YouTubers, some academics are YouTubers, but uh, people do things to sensationalize themselves or to get attention. There's the things that a YouTuber has to do to entertain people or get their attention is something different than what an academic has to do. An academic typically has to do nothing or wants to do nothing else but get their message across in an efficient way and talk about their ideas and their experience. And this is what you have here, okay? First-hand experience from professors who have gone through the system and have very, I think, relatable criticisms when it comes to things that have been said in the manosphere and online about the status of gender politics and the status of male and female relationships today. And one of the characteristics that is talked about a lot is about becoming untouchable, right? That there's people building a situation around themselves, an essence around themselves where they can't be spoken about. But the problem with that is then that becomes a limiting factor. That becomes a limiting factor because then, you can't set up a game in which you want to say you want equality, but then you can't be equally as scrutinized as other people for your statements, actions, philosophical outlook, or ideology. And that's something that happens, that is rife in the academy and in a lot of modern day political movements. We want to maybe call out the majority or who we think is the majority or the presiding, worldview or political outlook or whatever the case may be. But we do that in a way also to sanction ourselves as marginalized, and insofar as we're marginalized, you cannot criticize our position or our ideas or our judgments. And that's just simply unfair and not true. So we've got to keep skin in the game, right? So if you want skin in the game to criticize, you also have to take some of the criticism as well and be open to it. That is actually what is likely going to bring a fair society in the end. Now, she goes on to talk about people feeling threatened, and this is something I don't know if I've ever talked about on here, but it's a very important point. I'm going to read this again. So, people were threatened by the accomplished women on the faculty, those who had achieved what seemed unattainable to others. I didn't think any women who was really accomplished in a scholarly way seemed suspect to some. So this is something that, again, I don't know if I've talked about on here, but something I've very much witnessed when I was in undergrad around a lot of this kind of ideology, not feminist ideology necessarily, but just more like progressive ideology, where I started to find that a lot of the rhetoric that seemed to be going on about really about men or about successful people or about capitalism, about people that were doing well economically or whatever the case is, right? A lot of that rhetoric that seemed to be framed in some way as unjudicious or a state of inequality, that there's too many people that are wealthy, and there's arguments that can be made for that, especially today, not in the sense that they're too wealthy, but that maybe there's too much of our economy is held in finite sectors that most people don't have access to, and the money that's made in those sectors is not likely to trickle down, let's say, right? So there's arguments to be made about something like that, but that's not kind of what they're talking about. They're talking about capitalism as inherently unequal for the fact that some people will make more money than others, let's say. What I come to find from statements like that was that the resentment that people felt about others that were successful or others that had more money or whatever the case, it wasn't really about success or money. As she says here, the key word I want to focus on is feeling threatened by the accomplished faculty. It's being threatened by accomplishment. What I mean by that is, and again, something I very much felt when I was in the academy, is that it wasn't necessarily a war about economics. It wasn't a war about injustice, not necessarily a war about inequality, but a war on competency. I noticed that a lot of people that were very, very far left, very far progressive, and I'm not trying to like paint a broad brush or put anyone on one end of the spectrum and say they're all like this. No, but you can see patterns, with certain ideologies. It's not really about a person or about, all people on the left or all people that placate to that sensibility or are sympathetic to those ideas. No, but a pattern of thought that seemed to coincide with people that had a certain ideology. And the pattern of thought seemed to be that the pattern of thought and reaction seemed to be that they didn't really like people that were just competent in things. Because typically, to be successful, you have to be competent, and maybe competent in a lot of areas. And a lot of times, even in modern society, in capitalism, you have to be not only competent, but then industrious in some kind of way, or be involved in some kind of industrious venture. Like, take something like Elon Musk, right? He's revered in our society now today. He's a very industrious person, right? It's not just that he's smart, but he's also industrious, and successfully industrious, right? He's one of the most industrious people. He's one of the most industrious people we have seen. Harrison Ford is given a lot of credit for being industrious, but he existed in one domain, where someone like Elon Musk is going to many different domains and is very industrial and scaling in those domains. So that's part of why he's revered in the way that he is. But going back to my point here, I don't think it's the amount of money that's attached to these people that stokes the resentment. I think it has to do with something that she's talking about here, which is it's feeling threatened by people's accomplishments and being threatened by their competency. That a lot of what we see today doesn't really have to do with inequality, and like I'm saying, we can talk about facts and numbers and things like that in a different sort of way. That's not what I'm talking about necessarily. I'm just talking about the philosophic outlook. When people talk about inequality as a state of being in a capitalist society and stuff, I don't think they're really talking about inequality as such. I think they're talking about, a lot of times, the unequal amount of competency that others have and others don't want them to have sometimes. People are threatened by other people that might have more competency. And you would say, well, why is that? It seems counterintuitive, because naturally you would think that most people want to learn from others that are more competent. And I would say that's true, but there's also other types of individuals that, especially in a political context, who see it more like, well, if we can hold the competent back, then we have more of a chance, right? We have to remember politics is a game too, right? So, and there's also a game to be played for the populace. It's not just that the politicians play games, but there's games to be played on the populace front as well. And the way that the populace will play their games is usually with political philosophy. getting people to think, getting their peers to think like them, getting the people in their communities to think like them. And sometimes that means suppressing the competency of other individuals, because sometimes people will feel like they do not have a chance. And this is kind of what she talks about here. Probably the unconscious fear was that if we were to hand the program over to them, then people like us, the ones who started the program, wouldn't be acceptable. So what she's talking about there is kind of like sometimes people will have a fear of inadequacy, essentially, and won't maybe have enough faith in themselves that they could get ahead in a certain way, especially if they see someone who's further along than they are, or more competent in different areas than they are. They might feel like, hey, they can't catch up. And that's kind of where the whole meritocratic versus equity kind of comes in. The whole meritocratic argument versus equity or inequality, right? It's like, do we decide things on people's merits, or do we decide it based on people's needs, essentially, and what people have to have? Because we all have basically the same needs, but we don't really all have the same competency to justify our merits in gaining the things that we need. Okay, so how do we equalize that? Again, we have different answers for that. That's not what I'm arguing here. We could say that for another episode here, but I think a fair point that she's making, something that I very well witnessed and in these realms, very much something I witnessed in that kind of philosophy or ideology, is a tendency to almost want to hold back, tear down, or disallow certain people that are of a certain quality. Which again, it kind of, if you look at it on grand scale, it kind of makes sense, because the progressive scheme is to be more sensitive to those that, let's say, like, are marginalized, right? To use the language, that are marginalized. But when you do that, you necessarily, whoever you feel like is marginalized, you kind of want them to still be marginalized, because that's your group, right? This is one of the paradoxes, the kind of self-fulfilling prophecies that go along with this. There's a lot of other academics that talk about these kinds of things. Again, this is not really necessarily where the conversation is going today, but it's worth noting that it's like, if you have a philosophy that's predicated on an underclass, you might actually inadvertently start to promote the existence of that underclass more than you would trying to help the status of that underclass rise higher than where it is. Now, I'm not saying that that's the ultimate explanation. I'm just saying that is something to think about, and it's a criticism that people have made time and time again. I think there is a little bit of truth to it. It's something, I think, that if you reflect on kind of the status of human nature and psychology, it does kind of make sense, and that is kind of one of the biggest criticisms when it comes to the marginalized, kind of looking for social programs to uplift people, as opposed to trying to not just uplift themselves individually, but even trying to uplift themselves as a community, as they want to be, right? So it's this idea of, hey, you say you want better. Well, instead of encouraging or getting people to think that they can only be a certain way, or they are a certain way, or they only have a capacity to be at a certain level, why don't you encourage them to be at a different level? Why don't you encourage them to learn more, gain more skills, and maybe even learn from people that are further away from where they're at, so they can gain some traction and move forward in life as well. So I think it's a very strong argument. I don't think it accounts for everything, right? Things are more complicated than that. But I think there is something to say for the philosophic outlook that we have, especially amongst marginalized groups, for the fact that they're the ones that have the most to lose. They have a lot to gain, but they have a lot to lose in a sense, right? Because if you're marginalized, then you don't have as much opportunity, maybe you don't have as much education, and so on and so forth. Then what you think and what those around you think and what those around you are trying to get you to think is going to impact your life greatly. And it's not necessarily positive. It might not necessarily be positive. If people are putting in your head something that's ultimately going to get you to think lesser of yourself, or going to make you think that you're stuck, or going to make you try to think that you are permanently a part of a certain social class, and that you can't move forward unless someone in a higher social class gives up something and gives it to you, then there might be an issue with that. There might actually be an issue with that. Again, I'm not making any kind of argument against redistribution or anything of that nature. I'm not trying to promote any kind of idea like that, essentially. But I'm just raising question to the things of that nature, that sometimes these things are battles of competency, and unfortunately everything has ramifications. Every kind of idea has ramifications. Any kind of belief system has ramifications. Sometimes if you have a belief system that's predicated on people being marginalized or at a certain level, then you might inadvertently try to keep them there or promote them being in that kind of way. And this is what she's talking about here, about people being threatened by others that are excelling. Okay? Which again doesn't, the whole kind of conundrum there is that doesn't make sense in a system or in a philosophic outlook that is seeking equality, right? Or that's seeking even advancement or progressivism, right? If you want people to progress, then you should let people progress. The healthiest thing to do is to foster their own progress, and they can foster your own progress as well, and everyone wins, everyone moves forward. But there sometimes does exist a certain level of maybe resentment, or a certain level of contempt, or a certain level of feeling threatened by those that are competent, or that are more competent than what some people feel like they can never achieve, and that might spawn an unhealthy or toxic kind of environment. So that's a bit of Daphne Patai. Again, great book, great material in here. I think that's all we're going to do on this one, because I have so many other things to cover. We might come back to it, and we might also come back to heterophobia. This is a book on sexual harassment. Again, very pertinent books today. Again, I wanted to show you this because there's a lot of literature out there, and there's some great literature out there that's very pertinent to our times, that has to do with a lot of things, a lot of questions that are on our minds, that we think about all day, that we hear about all day, and we're getting them from people that are kind of maybe overly politicized or overly polemic, or, it's all drama, it's all spectacle. But here it kind of puts it in context. It gives you a real world view of people that have been in the academy, been struggling with these ideas, have been on the front lines of these ideas, and have stories on what happened when they were on the front lines of these ideas. This is kind of the Alan Sokol hoax of the Alan Sokol documentation of the feminist world right here with Daphne Patai and her books here. So indulge at your whim and at your pleasure, and we'll be back next Sunday for another video. Thank you.